Side 3.
The Pit Whence Ye Are Digged. On alternate Fridays during the university term, the senior fellows of this college entertain guests at dinner. Some of our guests are junior fellows of the college. Some are people who do interesting things in the world outside. Some are visiting academics to whom we offer the hospitality of the college during their stay in the university. At our last dinner for the present year, that is to say about a fortnight ago, we had two visitors of this latter class. One, an eminent Arabic scholar, was Dr. Abu Ben Adem from the University of Alexandria. The other was a Swiss, a Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim, from, I think, he said, the University of Basel. He seemed rather a queer customer. There's always a good deal of laughter at our high table, but he never laughed. Instead, he smiled in a disquieting way, as if he saw a joke hidden from the rest of us. Also, he kept looking at his watch, and it was a watch that caught the eye. "That's a handsome watch you have," I said to him, because one must make conversation, and his special subject, which I believe was some sort of physics, was unknown country to me. "Handsome? Indeed," said he. "Very old? Very precious?" He held it up for me to see. It was much larger than a modern pocket watch and beautifully cased in engraved gold. On the enameled face were many dials. The figures on some of the dials were Greek letters, and others were signs which I knew, because I dabble a little in such things, to be cabalistic. As he held it toward me, he touched a spring, and the watch chimed prettily. Chiming watches are great rarities, and I have never heard one finer than his. I put out my hand to examine it, but he drew it back to himself. Not to play with?" he said, smiling disagreeably. I felt a little snubbed and turned to talk to another guest. After we have dined in hall, the high-table group goes to the upper library, where we sit around a big table and divert ourselves with port and Madeira and general conversation. Abu Ben Adem and von Hohenheim sat across the table from me on either side of our visitor. He is used to queer customers. They are his stock in trade, and I knew he'd give them a good time. Sitting on my right was one of the young women who are now included among our junior fellows. I know it is considered inexcusably sexist in our time to say that any girl is charming, but it is hard to break the habit of a lifetime. She was charming. She was a lively talker, and I like a girl who has lots to say for herself. Quiet girls, whom some men admire so much, always make me think of clocks that have run down. She was well wound up, and she seemed to regard the college port as a pleasing light thirst-quencher instead of the mover of mountains that it is, and after a glass or two she was almost overwound. The talk on these occasions is often general. We fling remarks and sometimes whole paragraphs up and down the board in good, well-rounded voices. The people who say we shout don't understand academic courtesy. We are simply considerate of those who may be a little hard of hearing. The loudest outcry on this particular night came from Professor Swinton and Professor Wilson. "What are you two roaring about?" cried our visitor, who has himself a voice that dominates courtrooms and makes the boldest felons tremble. "About Scotland and the year 1974, shouted Professor Wilson. 1974, the year that has seen the Scottish nationalists on the march. And what better year for that? Is it not 700 years precisely since the birth of Scotland's mighty king and liberator, Robert the Bruce?" "Oh, you're daft," cried Professor Swinton. "Robert the Bruce was well enough in his small way, but this year is a far greater anniversary in the history of Scots culture and imperialism. For was it not in 1774 that the great Henry Duncan was born?" "And who might Henry Duncan be?" asked our visitor. Professor Swinton looked aghast. "Oh, man, I despise pair of ye, said he. Was not Henry Duncan the founder and the deviser of the Savings Bank? And has not Scotland ever since dominated the earth through the gentle, ameliorating, civilizing influence of the Savings Bank? Hoot-awa! Shouted our librarian from down the table. Scotland's poets are her glory, and let me remind you that Gavin Douglas was born 5 centuries ago to the year. When Scotsmen are in full cry, they must be resisted. Professor Lepine threw himself into the breach. Well, I'm not ashamed to say that I've never heard of Gavin Douglas, said he, but I remind you that a very respectable, if not positively a great poet, was born in 1774, and that was Robert Southey. Southey, shouted the librarian with Caledonian, nay, Nova Scotian contempt. Southey? Can you not do better than Southey? Yes, said Professor Lepine. Oliver Goldsmith died in 1774. He popped out just as Southey popped in. And Robert Herrick died in 1674. So there. The librarian uttered a wordless jeer. It was a Scottish sound, rather like a power saw striking a knot. You had to take refuge in deaths, he triumphed. Deaths will avail ye nothing. The rest of us rallied as well as we could to Lepine's defense. Our expert on Canadian literature is Dr. Claude Bissell. What about Robert William Service, the Bard of the Canadian North, born in 1874, he cried, and launched at once into... a bunch of the boys were whooping it up in the Malamute Saloon. The kid who tickles the ivories was hitting a jagtime tune. But he was overcrowed by a roar from Professor Stacy. If you talk of Canada, try this if you can. Who was born on the 17th of December... 1874. You don't know? Of course you don't know, but I know. It was William Lyon Mackenzie King. That's who was born on December 17th, 1874. Mackenzie King didn't write any poetry, said Dr. Bissell, who wanted to get on with the shooting of Dan McGrew. Oh, yes, he did, shouted Professor Stacy. It's not widely known, but I know it. And I'm bringing out a fully annotated edition of the collected poems of William Lyon Mackenzie King, including his 5-act blank verse drama, The Happy Conscript, within the next 20 years, so all the rest of you, keep your paws off it. Now, you're welcome to your Mackenzie King, shouted Professor Careless, who was late to get into the scrap, but the more valiant because of it. King wasn't the only Canadian poet to be born in 1874. In 20 years, I'm bringing out the collected poems of Arthur Meehan, including his mighty Ode to Coalition Government. Then we'll see who was the better man. It was the moment for the voice of reason, of taste, of moderation and civilization. And, of course, it came from Professor Finch. Allow me to remind you, said he, that apart from the lesser figures you mentioned, this year marks the 4th centenary of the birth of Prosper Joliot de Crébillon, an ornament of a great civilization. The librarian began a mocking chant. Dirty books, Finch only thinks about dirty books. Pardon me, said Professor Finch, with that perfection of high-bred scorn and unruffled temper which is peculiarly his own. I presume you, Mr. Librarian, are thinking of the son, Claude Prosper Joliot de Crébillon, whose witty novel Le Sofa might seem risque to a Calvinist mind, coarsened by the lewd rhymes of the exciseman Burns. But that was Crébillon fils. I was speaking of the dramatist, Crébillon père. It seemed to me that the conversation was growing rather too warm. I sought to cool it. Now, one of my disabilities as master of this college is that I really don't know much about anything. But I am paid part of my salary because of the pretense that I know a little about the theater. I fished in the dank tarn of my memory for a cooling fact and came up with a beauty. If you don't mind another pair of deaths, I said, the world of popular entertainment lost 2 of its brightest luminaries just 100 years ago. But I was not to have things all my own way. I never am. Of course, one of them was William Henry Betty, the young Ruscius, who died on August 24, 1874, said Professor Jacques Berger with an unconvincing affectation of carelessness. I was directing a look of scholarly rigor toward him when Professor Hume struck in. I I don't know why you worry about theatrical deaths when 1874 was the birth year of both Harry Houdini and Lillian Bayliss, said he. I was furious, but I smiled as sweetly as any finch. I only wish to draw attention to the death in 1874 of the original Siamese twins, Eng and Chang. I supposed its biological interest might appeal to you, but irony is lost on scientists who have just speared a humanist and beaten him at his own game. While this was going on, my young companion on my right had been getting rather heavily into the port, and the academic world was undulating before her in its brightest colors. Oh, it's all so, romantic, she cried. I just love olden times. Oh, I wish I could make a journey backward in time. I know I'd be somebody fascinating. I've sometimes thought that I'm a reincarnation of one of those marvelous women of an earlier day. One of those mistresses, they call them then. We all turned to her with looks in which pity and dismay were mingled. She was a clever girl. I won't tell you what she was studying, but it was one of the really clever subjects. She had a blazing array of marks and prizes, but it is precisely these clever people who reveal a very soft core when the port engulfs them. It was Dr. von Hohenheim who pounced. You ready, wish to journey back into time? Said he. Oh, yes, I do. You see, I have this very, very, very strong conviction that I'm a reincarnation, said our young guest. Dr. Abu Ben Adam struck in. Do be very careful, I entreat you, said he. We are all reincarnations, but of course we are simply reincarnations of our own forebears. Travel backward in time, and you will only find yourself your own great-great-great-great-grandmother, or somebody of that order. Oh, but I'm sure she must have been somebody wonderful, shouted the girl. Marie Antoinette or somebody like that. I've always understood there was French blood in the family. That might very well be, said Dr. Swinton unexpectedly. There was a friend here says it's a wise child that knows its own father. How wise does a child have to be to know its own great-great-grandfather? I'd love to know, cried the girl, who was now in a high state of excitement. I'd love to go back to 1774, for instance, and see who I was. She saw the doubt on my face and shook me by the arm. Think how it would be, all that graciousness and politesse and lovely clothes and lots of servants and things. I was about to suggest that one of the other ladies present take her out for a brisk walk around the quad in the cold air. But to my dismay, Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim rose to his feet, dominating the table. It can be managed, said he calmly, and took out his beautiful watch, which he held aloft. Be as thou wast wont to be, see as thou wast wont to see, he intoned solemnly, and then he pressed the spring, and the watch chimed so sweetly, so melodiously, that I have always been sensitive to music, thought I lost consciousness for a moment. And when I opened my eyes, what a scene confronted me. Oh, for the pen of my great master, Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann, to describe what I saw. It was our upper library still, and our table was the same. Our company was the same, too, but we were all in the dress of 1774. And we were all, I knew it with sickening conviction, our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers or grandmothers of that time, though which of the 128 possibilities I could not, of course, tell. That's where chance comes in, I thought to myself. And what a crew we were. It was pleasant enough for some. There, at one end of the table, Professors Swinton and Wilson were still disputing. But now they were the great Swinton of Swinton, arrayed in the height of Edinburgh elegance, and in the splendid panoply of a Highland chieftain, Wilson of Gun. I had occasionally heard Jock Wilson spoken of by his envious colleagues as a son of a gun, but I never felt the truth of it till that moment. They were still deep in a haggle about Scottish nationalism, for time had made little difference to them. They looked like portraits by Raeburn and gave a luster to the room far warmer even than the candlelight. The librarian, too, was still obviously a librarian, though he had no beard, and wore a wig that had seen better days. On his left arm was a black band, and I heard him explaining to his neighbour that it was mourning for the Scots poet Robert Ferguson, who had died a few weeks ago on the 16th of October, 1774. "The name of Ferguson will never die," he declared, and Dr. von Hohenheim, who was in an ominous suit of unrelieved black, murmured, "No, never so long as it is linked with the name of Massey." My eyes roamed round the table. A stunning figure was Professor Baines. Always the most fashionably dressed of our senior fellows, he was now obviously Beau Baines, the darling of Bath society. But our bursar, what was he? Bearded to his waist and swathed from head to foot in heavy, uncouth garments, with huge felt boots upon his feet, a Russian mujik in every detail. He was gazing across the table with extreme bitterness at George Ignatieff, the provost of Trinity, who was our guest that evening. Ignatieff, like Friesen, was heavily dressed, but with what a difference! The sables and velvets of a Russian boyar enwrapped him, and upon his head was a fur hat so immense that it might have broken the neck of a lesser man. He was drinking port straight from the decanter, and when it was empty he flung it with aristocratic nonchalance against the wall. But he was not silent. I gathered that he was attempting to secure a vast loan from a figure at his side whom I recognized as a forebear of Professor Abraham Rothstein, who was looking at his superb neighbor with the subtlety and amusement of an economist who knows financial innocence when he meets it. And who were those unhappy creatures at the other end of the table? That Scotsman, for he could be nothing else, almost naked except for a much-worn plaid and bearing every mark of crushing poverty. And could it be Walter Gordon? Yes, it was, and he was discussing the prospect of emigration to the New World with a figure who was so swathed in bandages that for some time I did not recognize him as Dean Safarian. He was explaining the intricacies of a recent difference of religious opinion his people had been having with the Turks. He said that as soon as he was fit to travel, he too was going to America. These two were agreeing that to live in subjection to a master race was hell indeed. Nor were they the only ones who were talking of oppression. There was Robert Finch, even more elegant in the 18th century than in this. You never saw such a wig, assuring Professors Stacey and Careless that any talk they had heard about imminent revolution in France was utterly without foundation. It was propaganda, he said, put about by people who did not understand the rock-like unshakability of the French throne. But Stacey and Careless were not wholly convinced. Stacey, obviously a Tory of the darkest blue, was becoming very angry with Careless, whose less formal dress suggested some revolutionary sympathies. He insisted that revolution in the American colonies was no more than a few months away, but Professor Stacey would have none of it. "Sir!" he roared, and I could tell by his form of speech that during some recent visit to London he had fallen much under the influence of Dr. Samuel Johnson. "Sir, I perceive that you are a vile Whig. The terms in which you speak of the man Jefferson must stand among the rankest effusions of encomiastic adulation." "Sir," countered Professor Careless, "your praise of King George is hyperbolical cant, but as it springs from ignorance rather than malignance, I forgive you, and I'll trouble you for the port, if that Russian hasn't drunk it all." "Liberté, égalité, fraternité." "Quelle blague," said Professor Finch. Perhaps I had better say the Abbé Finch, and laughed musically while getting the port first. Professor Lepin, I saw, was chasing a squirrel out of the plate of nuts, a squirrel that Jacques Berger, a zoologist even in the 18th century, carried about in his pocket. The noise of conversation was high. Two notable divines, the Reverend John Evans and the Reverend Northrop Frye, were hard at it. Dr. Evans defending the doctrine of salvation through works. The works one could grind out of others, while Dr. Frye was urging salvation through the refiner's fire of an exacting criticism of Holy Writ. A conversation on the fine points of agriculture was in progress between two obviously successful farmers across the table. Farmer Wells, who looked and dressed so much like John Bull that he might have stepped out of a drawing by Robertson, was arguing intently with Farmer Bissell, Capability Bissell he was called, because of his proven power of making 2 blades of grass grow where only 1 had grown before. Farmer Hume was fast asleep, his napkin covering his face, and from beneath the table appeared a pair of glittering top boots, the property of Beau Baines, who seemed to be resting there. Everybody was talking, except von Hohenheim, who glanced in every direction in an ecstasy of malicious pleasure, and Abu Ben Adam, who was wrapped in his Mussulman's robes, and being debarred by the Koran from drinking any port, was doing his best to eat all the dates on the table. Everybody was talking, and everybody was behaving in a manner which I felt certain was characteristic of the 18th century. It wasn't bad, except that several people scratched themselves more often than is usual in modern society, and those who wore wigs were apt to remove them from time to time in order to mop the perspiration from their close-cropped heads. There were quite a few gouty feet, and 1 or 2 wore spectacles of the Ben Franklin sort. Finch, needless to say, had a quizzing glass. And, of course, there was the spitting. Everybody spat, more or less, and now and then some of them, those from the eastern parts of Europe, blew their noses in a fashion rarely seen nowadays except in lumber camps. They had handkerchiefs, but their purpose appeared to be ornamental. It was the spitting which took my eye, figuratively and once or twice in actuality. The 2 American gentlemen, Stacy and Careless, were the great proficients in this art, and they spat, as was the polite custom of the day, over their left shoulders, rapidly and with a truly American force and efficiency. It is hard to see someone spit without wishing to spit oneself, so I spat, and that was when my own great revelation struck me. The Americans, as I said, spat briskly with a positively musical brio, but when I spat, I let my head fall forward, spread my feet, opened my mouth, and allowed gravity to take its course. Then I ground the result into the carpet, slowly, and as it were, compassionately. And as I did this, I knew what I was, what the 18th century meant to me, what 1774 revealed of me. I had been aware, as I gazed about the table, of a heaviness in the atmosphere. The air seemed infected with a woolly greasiness. I had assumed that it was Dr. Abu Ben Adam, who, like so many Arabs, was said to rejoice in oil. But I now perceived it to be the smell of lanolin. Not lanolin as you buy it for medical use, but as it exists on the unwashed wool of sheep. Now I knew that this smell came from myself. I was clothed from neck to knee in a homespun smock frock, and about my shoulders was a sheepskin of venerable age, presumably as a defense against rain and mist and the damp of the Welsh hills. Because, you see, I was a simple Welsh shepherd, marked and ingrained with the consequences of his calling. Upon my head was a hat of incalculable antiquity, such a hat as Adam may have worn after the fall, and my feet were warmly but untidily cased in more wool and gigantic greased boots. My hands were covered in tar, the tar shepherds use against that ovine disease, the foot rot. And I had just spat, as Welsh shepherds always do spit, with minimal effort, but with a primordial splendor that had something religious about it. It was thus, doubtless, that the shepherds spat on that notable occasion which we celebrate here, when they abode in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. I was roused from these reflections by a voice I knew in the very marrow of my bones to be a voice of authority, the voice of my betters. It was Dr. John Evans, and to any Welshman of the rank in which I found myself, the voice of an Evans of Ysbyty Ystwyth is like the music of the harp. "Tu art Muslim?" said he, but the words fell upon an uncomprehending ear, and he saw what the trouble was, pointed at the wine bottle, and spoke again. "Brenin I pen biliaid," said he, and the cruel words of abuse had an age-old familiarity. I passed the drink at once. bowing, cringing, and rubbing the mouth of the bottle with my greasy sleeve as I served the gentry. But inwardly I was stricken, though I seemed to comprehend through my vision what others were saying, or were likely to be saying in English. Not one English word could I utter. Arun weth yikida meraglau, said I to Dr. Evans, bowing obsequiously. But he waved me aside, as he had every right to do, him, a great man of education, and me, the humble shepherd of the flocks. But I glared across the table at that villain von Hohenheim, and muttered a curse in Welsh that made him wriggle in his chair, mighty magician though he was. But mine was not the worst case. What of the poor girl who had held such high hopes of the 18th century, who had talked so innocently of its graciousness, who had been certain that in that bygone time she would have been a mistress, and a scented, pampered mistress of royalty, no less? She was padding about the table in her bare feet, a single ragged garment tied around her waist with a dirty string, her hair in filthy disarray, and in her hand a bunch of what I took to be weeds. But it wasn't weeds.
Won't you buy my pretty lavender 2 bunches a penny?
She sang in a voice coarsened with gin. But there was a glance in her eye that made it clear that lavender was not everything she sold. Some of the men waved her away, others gave her extremely small coins, which they found in the depths of their pockets. Swinton of Swinton pinched her behind, but perfunctorily, as if it were a social duty rather than a pleasure. Nobody seemed to want to buy anything at all. My heart wept for her. But yet I thought, even from Gin Lane in the 18th century, the modern Ph.D. may arise. I took a deep breath of hope, and immediately wished I hadn't, for the warmth of the room was working powerfully on my sheepskin. At no time did the girl approach me, but as she passed, my heart yearned toward her in pity. I hooked her to me with my crook and blessed her. Bendit your argluit putain fech. I cried as tears started from my eyes, but she utterly mistook my words and my intention.
Not for 20 golden guineas,
she said, drawing her poor garment about her with pathetic pride. I had little time to grieve over this misunderstanding, for I heard a familiar voice at my elbow. It was the college steward, putting his usual question at this time of the evening. "May I blow out candles?" he asked, and I nodded assent. I knew that it would do nothing to untangle the complexities of the evening to address Miroslav Stojanovich in Welsh. Slowly, ceremoniously, he extinguished each candle. In that brief moment when all the candles are out and the electric lights have not yet been put on, I heard von Hohenheim's chiming watch, and, you must believe me, it was playing the same tune as before, but playing it backward, as Bach sometimes reversed a subject in counterpoint. And as it played, I recovered myself, and the English tongue, completely. In the clean new light, I turned to the girl beside me and said, "Will you have some coffee, or perhaps a little cognac?" She, too, was quite herself, her 1974 self, now.
"Cognac every time," said she.
As I went to fetch it for her, I found myself next to the unspeakable Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim. He smiled darkly at me and flung me a quotation from Scripture. "Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek the Lord. Look unto the rock, whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit, whence ye are digged." I am unfailingly polite to college guests. Isaiah 51, reading from the first verse, said I, smiling serenely. But he won't be asked again.